Well, hello, everyone. Welcome to the 9th International Fire Ecology and Management Congress. I'm awfully excited to welcome you all and really glad we can get our first session started. On behalf of the program committee, we're all really excited to share with you this week and to convene with you centered around the theme of life with fire, prescriptions for resilience. My name is Morgan Varner, and I'm the chair of the Congress. And before we begin, I want to go through some housekeeping, and these are tips to help you get the most out of this experience as possible. There we go. Okay, so if we look at the navigation bar there to your left, first the agenda, if you see that there beneath home, provides an overview of the entire conference and all the individual sessions. It's where you'll go to join a session if you look into the schedule. So simply click on that agenda, and then you'll see sessions beneath it like that. To join a session, what you'll do is click View Session if you look there in the middle, or Add to My Agenda to create your personalized agenda for the day or the multiple days. Once you're in a session, you'll see the chat and the Q&A tabs. These are specifically for the session you're viewing. Use the session Q&A tab to your right to ask speakers questions in each session, and the chat tab is a way to say hi to each other or engage otherwise in sessions throughout the conference. We also have several on-demand and oral presentations available. You can find these at the top of the session agendas for Tuesday, November 30th. And once you click on-demand oral presentation, scroll to see the available content. These will be available for the duration of the conference and in our post-conference session recordings. You'll also find the posters under the agenda tabs. There it is. By clicking on the poster title, you'll see the abstract, a video highlighting results if the presenter provided one. Then you can click on the PDF to see a full screen view of the poster. The posters are all available now, but we'd strongly encourage you on Thursday from 3 to 4:30 Eastern Time to join us in the poster session to engage with the presenters. And we're also hosting a student poster contest with first, second, and third place prizes for student poster presenters. Below posters, you'll see attendees where you can see everyone who is a part of the Congress and connect with them throughout the week. And again, judging from yesterday and early this morning, you're already doing that quite a bit. Below that are the community boards, a fun way to dive into active discussions, create your own topic or social group, and suggest virtual meetups with other attendees, the thing that we will really miss from not being in person. And then jumping down to the exhibitor center, which you can think of as virtual booths for the Congress sponsors, we encourage you to participate in the passport contest where you can collect digital stamps from participating booths and be entered into a drawing for a prize. And finally, if you need any technical assistance, as I see them already pop up, here's the number. You can text or call 503-564-3044 to reach our friendly tech support team. With that, I'd like to first introduce and welcome Dr. Chris Dicus, who is the president of the Association for Fire Ecology and also a professor of wildland fire and fuels management at California Polytechnic State University. He served as president for the last 4 years. Take it away, Chris.
Thank you so much, Morgan. Well, welcome everyone to what we were hoping to be Dustin, Florida, where, you know, on the beautiful white sands of Florida, but darn it if COVID hadn't got the best of us in a lot of different ways. And I come by, you know, I live in California, so I can say, you know, what a long, strange trip it's been. But we were so stoked that you're here. And Morgan's going to tell you a little bit later about the countries represented, how many folks, but just let you know that this has really exceeded our expectations as far as the amount of folks that are here. And it's really set up to be a great, great presentation. You know, we all know that we want to be in the all together. We want to be sharing a cold beverage of our choice with one another, but we're doing the very best we can. I think we've got a great week for you. So my goal is kind of tell you about some things about what the Association for Fire Ecology is doing. As we're putting on this conference in partnership with Tall Timbers. And AFE from the very beginning, starting from a very small group of people that were just interested in fire ecology, and they didn't feel like their voices are being kind of heard in the general fire world, is they wanted to improve the knowledge of use of fire in land management through science and education. So we wanted to have really good things that's great for the land, great for the people out there using fire in a site-specific way, but it'd be based upon science. And from the very beginning, we thought that the education would be a huge part of this. So we would include not only sort of universities and other sorts of training programs that we had, but also via our good people in, with our students that we had. So in general, we've got, this only can work because we have a really great board of directors that's out there. You can see this, the list that's here. We're from across the world. Our vice president, Francisco Sejo, is from Spain. We have, our treasurer is from Mexico, and we're really trying to increase the footprint and our impact across the world from a very humble beginnings that started literally just about 20 years ago. And man, what a long way it's been. So we've got a lot of really great high-end workers, and we get along together even with different worldviews, and you can be proud of your board of directors that work incredibly hard on your behalf and upon our profession's behalf. And I just want to acknowledge that none of this could be happening without the real hero out here, our executive director, Annie Oxelart, who has answered approximately, I think at last count, 1.7 bajillion emails this week. And so she's just an amazing person without whom we couldn't do any of this. All right. So we mentioned that we have always talked about students, and we knew that we wanted students to be there. So kind of an independent group, but is part of our board directors that has a voting seat, is the Student Association for Fire Ecology, which is a auxiliary of the parent organization, AFE. And we're so excited to see that we have got chapters, active chapters, all across the United States. Now, that sounds great to me, I'm here, but one of the things that we're really hoping to do is, like, this is not just an American organization by any stretch of the imagination. We have members on every single continent, excluding Antarctica. And, if you're at a university or some place that you think that in Canada or Spain or South Africa or Bolivia, it doesn't matter. If you think that you've got room for a safe chapter, let's talk about this and make it happen, because, we all know that if we're a profession, we've grown up, we've changed so much over the last 20 years. And a big part of it is because of our active membership of our students. And in fact, at least one of our previous presidents was very active as a safe when they were coming up through, became a professional, and then they ended up being president of the association. So what a wonderful way, if you're a student, if you haven't been involved, to get involved with SAFE, because this is just a fantastic group. We offer sort of scholarships to different SAFE chapters across the country to do different things by providing travel funds, by providing opportunities for prescribed burning and others, to try to really get into that, as we say at Cal Poly, where I work, learn by doing, to actually do the stuff and not just sit in front of yet another PowerPoint presentation. So on this note, kind of related, and this is something that's really important, and this is important for both our students that are on board right now, as well as our professionals, is that at the behest of our board member, Mark Kive, he and others have set up this incredible Mentoring Futures program, and students or young professionals can apply within this program and get matched up with someone that has similar interests and some kind of being able to help you through whatever your interest might be, and the whole thought of this is that because fire ecology, we're a growing field, and sometimes we can kind of sort of feel alone that's out there. Well, let's pair you up with someone that we know that kind of has the same interest and can kind of push you through and kind of help guide you, in your future. And this has really been successful. But I can tell you, we can always take more students into this mentoring programs, which you can see the website at the bottom of the page right here to be able to sign up. And also, we need more professionals. If you feel like you have something to give, and we all have something to give, please sign up for this as a mentor to these students and these young professionals to kind of help guide them, because this is sort of this pipeline, this continuous pipeline of new, good, bright people coming up through the system into our profession. Now, another thing kind of related to education and kind of little street cred that you might have is that we have multiple sort of certification pathways that we provide. And so some of the initial certifications, if you're just starting out in the field, we have a wildland fire technician, a fire practitioner, and then this kind of increases along as you went up through the profession. And we've got different pathways for if you're in the fire management, say you work for an agency and you're quote unquote doing the stuff, and you want to be certified with this, there is a pathway for you. In the same way, if you're more like, well, I love doing the stuff, but what gets me going in the morning is kind of research and solving problems. We have a science pathway as well in fire ecology. And something that's just come up new with our certification committee and some really, really good people is that we now have certification pathways within like fuels management. So we got fire ecology, we have fire management, we also have fuel management, and there's certification pathways for you. And I encourage you, get certified. It's a great thing. It's just another thing for street cred, for young students they're coming up. This is a great way, young professionals, just another thing that you can put on your resume to set yourself apart from others. All right, another thing just really excited about is our journal, Fire Ecology. For those that are on the science end here, this is the journal has, again, we've come a long way, baby, and we're doing really, really great. And typically we publish anywhere from like 30 to 40 papers per year. And if you're a sciencey type person, a citation index of 2.738, that's really good compared to where, other sorts of peer journals that we feel really, really good about. And so it's a great place to be able to publish your work in there. And so we're excited that every single year we have articles from every single continent. I guess the penguins aren't lighting fires down in Antarctica, but we have articles from across the world, and at least with the Spanish speaking nations, we have translators to be able to get through them. And it's a very, very quick review process. Bob Keane, the editor, has just got a legion of really, really competent associate editors. Will get your papers from the time it gets to their inbox, get you out, and hopefully get you published as quickly as possible. Assuming that it's a great paper, which I'm sure that everyone is, if you're going to submit it, it's going to be a good paper. And just let you know, sort of a member benefit of this is that page charges, which is something that journals do, is that if you're a member of AFA, you get a 15% discount on those page charges. So that's an incentive. Go do good things, publish your stuff in fire ecology, read the works in there. And if you don't have time to read every single article every single month, one of the things that we've started doing, again, via Bob Keane at the Missoula Fire Lab, started these sort of podcasts, these fire ecology chats about specific articles within the journal. And you can see the URL at the top of the page there, the fireecology.org/chats. This is sort of a podcast where you can get in and look at specific sort of like having the author have a discussion about their particular paper that just got published in the Journal of Fire Ecology. So I highly advise you do this. It won't bore you. Even though we sciencey people, we can kind of talk, in sciencey terms. This is a great way, and they do a really, really good job of taking kind of high-end science in a lot of places and kind of bringing it down to something that maybe you and your grandparents can sit around and watch at night. Now, another thing that we're doing, we kind of mentioned earlier that we're trying to expand our footprint across the world, and because we know that we have fire ecologists on, every continent. We have peers on the African continent, from Australia, from Europe, from South America, and throughout North America, and as we're doing this. One of my goals as president, over the last 4 years is kind of expand our influence, because we know that we have people that are out there, peers that are in management or in science, that they're just looking for a home. And so we're your home. And so one of the things that we've really been trying to do for 2 years in a row now, we've had this conference scheduled in Florence, Italy, where we've partnered with the Pal Costa Foundation and some other really great partners in Europe and Italy. And so for 2 years in a row, COVID has kind of delayed this. We did have sort of an interim international sort of virtual event, but it's we're moving ahead with this, and we're really hoping 2021, 2022, that COVID's just going to go away, and that we're all going to find ourselves sitting in Florence, Italy, because that's something I would very, very much like to do. And I've been totally bummed out as president that this thing's been delayed for 2 years because of our ugly friend COVID. All right, so I got a question for each of you. We have a quiz that's out there that we're kind of trying to figure out, what is your motivation for attending? Why are you here? And we kind of want to know, so we can kind of help shape and guide, how we're are you looking to learn the latest science for your research? Are you wanting to learn ways how to do a better job in fire management? Are you looking for networking opportunities and chances to meet new people? Which, granted, it's not as easy if we're not sitting around a fireplace together talking shop. Or were you here because you heard that there were supposed to be some really cool beaches in Destin, Florida, and you're like, wonder where we're at?
Hey, Chris, this is Annie. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay, great. Hey, everyone. So we added the quiz. It's in Whova under the subsession that we're in right now, but I'm also going to add it in the main session. So it'll be there in just a moment, and it'll be open, and you guys can add in your answers as we go. You can also type into the chat if you want to go ahead and do that.
Yeah, so this is just kind of a curiosity, that we have, because we want to be able to best meet our attendees' needs, and as a form of our own active management, we can be able to see what your hopes, your goals, that you might have for this week. And again, we all know it's a different experience. Certainly this week in the virtual world. So like these days, you can wear a nice suit, but as we've seen different places, probably half of us are on board are probably wearing pajama bottoms at the same time. All right, well, just in the name of time, just as we're thinking about this, you can continue on with this quiz that we've got up. But I'm kind of end up with just saying that, ending up with this, just let you know that within AFA, it's so important to everyone that's here, is that you have a feeling of belonging. We all have different motivations, experiences, worldview. And frankly, over the last, with our weird world that we're living in, two people can look at the exact same event and come away with sometimes completely opposite conclusions from that. But I want you to know that AFA's tent, that's okay. AFA's tent is big enough, and all are welcome, regardless of how you identify. And, whatever, political party, gender, where you're at in the world. And so I want to differentiate that from having a feeling of like, you're trying to fit in. It's been my goal that within AFA, you don't have to fit in, which fit in means you have to kind of change who you are in order to feel like you're welcome. And so within AFA, the goal that we have is like, you don't have to change who you are. You have a voice. It doesn't matter who you are, or where you're living. We want you to have a feeling of belonging. It's this sort of this shared mutual respect that we have from one another. And I did kind of allude to it earlier, about, it's been a weird, hard year, couple of years that we have. And it's not been easy. It's not been easy for any one of us. And AFA, wants to say, we encourage you in this, and if I can be vulnerable with you for a little bit, and probably shouldn't do this, but I will anyway, is that, over this period of time, I mean, I've experienced my own, what I refer to as soul crushing depression, which I couldn't figure out. It's like, why am I feeling this way? And I think that a lot of us have felt sort of this feeling of aloneness. And in fact, this was really punctuated with a friend of mine this last summer, that brilliant, gentle man, earned his PhD in theoretical physics at the age of 24, took his life because he had like this feeling of hopelessness. And, I know that I'm not alone. This is something that's going all around. And we fired people. We don't tend to talk about this. We tend to try to be, superheroes that are out there. And it's so important that, recognizing that you're a human being, and that, talk about this, talk about your peers, through these emotions that you have, and know that AFA supports you. We want you to feel belonging. You're not alone that's here. So in short, I'll conclude up here is just let you know again that AFA has a big enough tent for everyone. It doesn't matter if you're in management, it doesn't matter if you're a scientist, if you're an educator, it doesn't matter, what gender that you are, doesn't matter where you're at in the world. So with this big tent, with this feeling of belonging, just know that AFA and me personally, just advise you, just as we move through in these weird times, it's just, be kind to one another, be empathetic, be patient with one another. And above all, as we come through as this organization of peers, we're more than that. We're friends in a lot of ways. Just be loving to one another out there. So that is the end of my sort of diatribe. I figure after 4 years of presidency, I get to get on my soapbox for a little bit, but just know that you belong, you have a place. And it's so important that you don't feel alone. And so on that note, this week as we're coming through, it's a lot easier to do when we're a person, I know, but seek out people. There, we've got the list of attendees. If you don't know that person, just kind of check in with them, chat with them. It's a great way for peer networking and someone, you can, I've done this in the past and have had, developed literally lifelong relationships just by reaching out to people I didn't know. And so I suggest that you do the same this week, which is a little bit harder in the virtual world, but it can be done. And so with that, I will leave you and turn this back over to Morgan Varner, who will then talk to you about, the rest of the conference.
Thanks, Chris.
So
I always appreciate Chris does a really good job of I was thinking about this on the way home yesterday. I had said something about attendees, and Chris is always really good about recasting that as participants. And I want to echo what Chris just said about you being a participant in this. None of us are getting rich off of our volunteerism with the Association for Fire Ecology. We're all doing it because we love what we do. We love our professional society and our colleagues. And I think for those who are new, we have several events set up this week to engage you. And for those that are seasoned veterans, please reach out and show some leadership. What I'm going to do briefly is talk a little bit more about how we got here, a little bit about the conference theme, and then eventually get to the introduction of our first plenary speaker. First thing I wanted to do was say a little word about the conference theme. You've all seen it. This is the first time that I've been the program chair, and so I actually sort of cared about what the theme was going to be. I didn't want it to be a throwaway, like, we're going to talk about fire ecology as the theme. And we labored over this, and it's interesting because the theme we came up with, Life with Fire, Prescriptions for Resilience, it has different meanings to different people and different disciplines. I'm a fire ecologist, a plant person. And so when I look at the first part of that, life with fire, I think plants and fire interacting, vegetation, fire feedbacks. But my social science friends say, no, it's humans and fire together, Morgan. That's what life with fire means. So it means different things, but it still gets to the theme. The second part, the prescriptions for resilience, I think about those plant communities responding, or the individual plants responding to fire, bouncing back from fire injuring them. And my social science friends tell me, no, it's about community stability. It's about humans living with fire in fire-prone communities. And so I'm excited that this is our theme for the week, and excited to talk to you about it. And when I say I really mean we. This was flashing up as we first got started this morning. This is the program committee. Their names are listed here, but when we first started this process 2 years ago, so if you can go back in the time machine 2 years ago, we never heard of COVID-19. We were all planning a working Congress at just happened to be at the beach. And we were excited about a place-based meeting to show off fire ecology and management toward that theme. So this group of people signed on to do that, to pitch in at a place-based event. As COVID started the waves that we all have suffered through, we decided to go to a hybrid event. And as you all saw, the eventual was to go to a fully virtual event. And so this program committee signed on for much more than they intended. And so if you see them or chat with them, please thank them all. When we originally started it, I'm a basketball fan, and I was my favorite basketball team of all time was the USA Olympics team, the Dream Team. And so we coalesced this Dream Team. And so the heads of these people, and in particular, as Chris mentioned, the coach in this case, Annie Oxerart, who did a tremendous job. And like I said, this is not to trivialize the real suffering that's taken place with COVID, but this group of people really stepped up to contribute to what we all love. It's just meeting, talking about the work we do, networking, and learning. In addition, literally the conference would not be possible without the financial support of sponsors, exhibitors, and other supporters. So if you're a part of one of these organizations, thank you. If not, and you work with these organizations, please continue to. And again, thank you for your support. You also may have seen this slide popping through before we got started. One of the early challenges to the program committee from the AFA board was, this is an international fire congress, and it's always been a struggle for the association to engage the international community. Chris mentioned the struggles with Florence and COVID, which clearly would have been a very international meeting. But here, a meeting in North America where we tend to get 5 to 10% international involvement. This year, maybe thanks to COVID, if I could say that, the silver lining is that 25 countries are represented. More than 20% of the total attendees are not from the United States, which is by far a record. It doubles or triples, quadruples what we usually expect. And so that accessibility that the virtual platform provides is something we should celebrate. I think this will have long-term implications for fire congresses of the future. Once you're in, you're hooked, and I'm hoping that takes place. Annie texted me a minute ago the total attendance for this meeting that we had wrung our hands over, hoping to get 300, 350. The total attendance now is over 500. So again, really exciting, and we're excited to give you a great program this week. Annie made this word cloud, or word flame, if you will, of the talks that'll be presented this week. The conference presentations are a small part, maybe a large part of what a conference is. I think it's what we usually assume, but lots of stuff happens at this meeting. And if you follow the agenda in Whova, there are lots of ways for you to interact and be engaged. I like these because they are both a picture and 1,000 words. And this really says a lot of the things that I think we're all excited to talk about and to learn about. And so I see my words there. I see pine, I see fire, I see use, there's conifer, restore. Each of us can look at this and see the areas that we're really, really interested in and how they're going to be presented during the week. Like Chris said, well, in addition to the beach, I was really excited to share my homeland with you, for us to take field trips, for us to talk, and maybe skip out on Thursday afternoon and go for a walk in these beautiful woods that that fire has maintained in the Southeast. These sorts of ecosystems, tremendous biodiversity, tremendous cultural value, and a haven for rare species, and really a national and international model for the coexistence of humans and fire, that life with fire part. So I'm sorry that we didn't get to do that. The association between the Association for Fire Ecology and Tall Timbers, the organization that I work for, was not an accident. Tall Timbers began holding what grew into international fire ecology conferences in 1962 in Florida, and is something we've always been engaged in and excited to share, and to share how those ecosystems are maintained. That picture I showed you before is a place where fire occurs every 1 or 2 years and has been that way for millennia. These ecosystems are growing in areas that have a humid climate with rich soils that otherwise would be agriculture or closed canopy forests if not for fire. And sharing these ecosystems and celebrating them would have been the main, for me, the main event. And for you, I hope you tune in to talks that are focused on that portion, this life with fire. The fire that is in these ecosystems, like they are in your homelands, promote tremendous biodiversity, plants, animals, game, non-game, the things that we all value from a variety of perspectives. And that's certainly the case in the southeastern pine ecosystems and the diversity of fire-prone ecosystems across the region. And also welcoming you to Florida, not just from a biological standpoint, but from a regulatory standpoint. If you're not familiar with this, Florida leads the United States in prescribed fire, burning somewhere around 2 million acres per year. And if you drill down into the hot spots and hot moments of prescribed fire, it's really concentrated in the place where our conference was going to be held, right there. And if you were going to take a trip to Tall Timbers, you would see that little dot there. So tremendous amount of prescribed fire focused on all of the things that we all care about. And so it really becomes the national and perhaps an international model for that coexistence of humans and fire. Florida is not a very rural state, nor are many of the southeastern states, tremendous development pressures, et cetera. And so it really brings that question, this prescription for resilience part of the theme. All is not well in the Southeast with fire. It's a challenging environment. Florida is faced with tremendous pressure from people from all over the world, like many of you wanted to visit and then to stay. And so fire occurring in adjacent to the wild and urban interface, fire occurring where new roads, et cetera, are proposed and built, all challenge the future of fire in this landscape. And they really do. In the title, we didn't put a question mark, but that is truly a question mark. How do we design prescriptions that are for resilience? As a case in point, this last year, we'll talk about COVID a lot during the Congress, but we found in the Southeast that COVID induced a 20 to 40% decline in prescribed fire in the place where prescribed fire happens the most in North America. So we know that there are structural problems that COVID-19 may be a harbinger of things to come in different ways, whether it's a pandemic or something else. And I think that the word flame on the right, I looked at it and looked for my own biodiversity slant to look. I was picking and choosing, but when I look back at it, I see risk. I see notations about non-native species, it starts to get at the real challenges. And that's, I think, what we're going to be really getting out of it this week, is that we're going to be talking not only about the biodiversity and our dreams about these ecosystems, but also about the challenges they face. I will close and transition, but wanted to recognize it's a little bit of a conference du jour happening, that there is a native lands acknowledgement. This is not a place-based meeting because of the virtual platform, unfortunately. You know, where I am in Tallahassee at Tall Timbers, we're on Appalachian land. Each of you are in a different spot on the planet where native peoples are, or were extirpated. We're, you know, the effects of colonization on fire regimes, on ecosystems, and on people has been dramatic across the planet. I think it's important that each of us, wherever we are, thinks about native land acknowledgement, but beyond the sort of, saying something about it, but starting to do something about it. And I think that was part of our inspiration for many parts of this meeting, where our first plenary this morning will be focused on Indigenous fire stewardship. If you've looked through the program, you'll notice that it's not the only spot. There'll be several locations for embracing Indigenous fire and traditional ecological knowledge. And I would encourage each of you to attend, like I said, participate, but also to think about ways that you might include Native peoples in your thinking and doing with fire and fire ecology. And with that, I want to introduce our plenary speaker for the morning. I think it's a great pleasure to introduce Dr. Don Hankins. Don is a professor of geography and planning at California State University, Chico, and also the field director for the CSU Chico Ecological Reserves. His areas of expertise include pyrogeography, water resources, conservation, and indigenous land and water stewardship. His research includes wildland fire with an emphasis on landscape scale, cultural, and prescribed fires, and the implication of these fires to biodiversity conservation and environmental change. Don's work includes various aspects of land management, policy, and conservation with a variety of organizations and agencies, including indigenous entities in North America and Australia. Don, it's all yours.
Hidi Chin, and thanks for the opportunity to present at this year's Association for Fire Ecology World Congress. It's been 2 years since the last Congress, and I was particularly looking forward to the opportunity to travel. The last Congress we attended was the last time that I traveled because of COVID restrictions. I think about the opportunities that are there, and I was really looking forward to traveling to Florida to see you all, to maybe spend some time on the beach, maybe do some surfing, and also go light some fires with Morgan Varner at the Tall Timbers Institute. I think that in terms of reflecting on that, there's some interesting opportunities that are there for us to use these times to think about the way that we relate to the world around us. In particular, thinking about the last Congress, spending time in the Santa Mountains in Arizona, I was able to get out and see the footprints of past fires, and ultimately be in a place where fire would be just a few months from the time that we had our Congress there in the Santa Catalina Mountains. I think also about the Black Summer fires that were burning in Australia at the time that we were meeting, and the impacts of those fires in Australia, and ultimately the fires that played out elsewhere across the American West and elsewhere in the world during the 2020 fire season. And it's been a lot of that same kind of thing happening over the last few years that really, to me, resonates a sense of urgency around the way that we relate to fire. And so I'll begin with that thought today. Have you ever considered your role and place as a fire steward? Indigenous peoples of fire-prone regions have a unique relationship with fire and have used fire for many thousands of years to steward the landscape in a way that we need to get back to. And so with that theme in mind, I'll begin my presentation today. The theme for this year's Congress is Life with Fire, Prescriptions for Resilience. When I think about that particular terminology, I think about indigenous fires. and following the original instructions, which I'll talk about in my presentation today. To begin with, I'd like to just take a moment to think about the lands that we're all on. For myself, as a Muco traditional cultural practitioner coming from the Central Valley of California, I think about my responsibilities to the homelands where my ancestors have lived for many thousands of years, and also from the lands that I'm speaking from in Coyomcowi territory in the Lassen foothills in California. And I think that regardless of wherever we're at, and particularly for myself, as I travel around the world, I meet with different people and I'm in their homelands, and I think about the traditional responsibilities not only that those individuals have, but that we all have as stewards of the landscape, and the reciprocity that we have through kinship systems to those places. And so we all have gained responsibilities to the lands that we're on, and we all have a responsibility to act upon that to be good stewards of the world that we live in. As I look back over the past 20 years and see how Indigenous fire has come to a new place, where Indigenous fire has gone from having very little recognition to the place that it is now being talked about more in terms of academic circles and also within the media. Many documentaries, feature films coming out talking about Indigenous fire. The 2019 and 2020 fires in Australia and across the American West exemplifies some of the issues that we see in terms of the way that our lands need to be stewarded. And we've got a lot of recognition about the opportunities that are there for Indigenous stewardship to be put back into the landscape again. And I think about that and consider how all of these places where wildfires have occurred and where they always are occurring is somebody else's homelands. It's their country. It's a place that's loved. And so this really provides an opportunity for us to think about how to live differently with fire. But before we go too far into understanding the place of Indigenous fire today, it's important to understand the past. And thinking about the narratives of the ways that Indigenous people have been portrayed in early explorer accounts and even from our own stories and narratives. And one narrative that sticks out of my mind from early explorers is the Vizcaino expedition, or what was called the Sacred Expedition, traveling through the Pajaro River Valley in 1769 out of Monterey Bay. And the Spanish expedition traveling up through Amamutsan homelands came across a landscape that was tended to, that was loved. And as the Spanish arrived into the Mutsunaloni village, they came to a place where a ceremony, a very sacred ceremony, was taking place around the California condor. And that relationship of condor relates back to the stories of fire and the responsibilities of people tending to the land and caring for it. When the Spanish arrived in that village, they came to a place that was completely vacated. There were no inhabitants there because they had left because of the advance of the Spanish into that place and the fear for them. And so when I think about that landscape and what the Spanish explorers saw, they saw that relationship of Indigenous peoples to the land, but didn't necessarily think about that. And I'll come back to that idea in a moment. In July of 1770, shortly after the time of the Vizcaino expedition traveling up the Pajaro River Valley, the Cook expedition made it to where present-day Cooktown is in Queensland, Australia, in Gugu Yamathir country. And according to Cook's journals, he describes that the Indigenous peoples coming aboard the ship to retrieve turtles that the crew had taken. And as it turns out, these turtles are part of the totems of the Indigenous peoples from this region of Cooktown. And ultimately, in retribution for taking these turtles, the local Indigenous peoples set fire to areas where the possessions of people from the crew were placed on the shore, laundry and different things like that. And so they burned some of those items that were belonging to the crew, but also showing their stewardship and responsibility to the land. This takes me to think about how Indigenous peoples have resisted and persisted through these different periods of settlement and how the knowledge of fire and stewardship exists in these different places. And in Julie Dowling's painting, Warrior, from 2006, which portrays an Indigenous resistance fighter in Tasmania who, with one arm open, holding a rifle in a hand and a pistol in her waist belt, is welcoming people to her country And I think about the kind of responsibility that we as Indigenous peoples have to steward our land, the types of things that we would do to protect our lands, and the laws that we have to keep us in check within our places, and the responsibilities that others who've come to these lands should also be following. So that takes me to this idea of whose law. As a Muko traditional cultural practitioner, I can say that my understanding of fire is very much rooted in my understanding of our sacred geography and the landscape of the Central Valley and the awareness of our fire stories. And for every Indigenous community that I've worked with around fire, I know that a very similar story around fire exists. For us, that fire, the first fire that happened, was a devastating fire. It burned the world. It made it uninhabitable. But then we learned to steward with fire, and we learned to take responsibility for the things that exist within our landscape and that we have a relationship with. And so I think about the condor as the pinnacle of that in our own creation story, and how that landscape, that everything the condor needs to survive, is ultimately supported through a network that is created and stewarded with fire. Fire also can be used as a way of penalizing. And I think about the story that's portrayed in Clifford Possum Japijari's painting from 1977 that portrays a fire story from the central desert of Australia where Langata and his two sons were out hunting, and the sons were not following the rules of the land and not following the traditions. And so Langata sent fire in the direction of his sons. And in this painting, we can see that his two sons died in the east of where this place of the first fire began. And they were overrun by fire and ultimately paid the price with their lives for not following the rules. But fire is a necessary part of our world, and it's something that we all, as traditional cultural practitioners, take a responsibility to steward with. Indigenous knowledge is time-tested. For instance, the Mardu in the western desert of Australia have terms in their language to recognize the serial states of fire within their landscape. Considering the impacts of colonization on Indigenous peoples, languages, cultures, and landscapes, it's hard to imagine what knowledge systems may have existed at one time, but likely were present in many of these places. I think about some of the indicators that we have within our landscape that tell us that a certain place should be ready to burn based on maybe the sequencing of flowering within a plant community or something along those lines. And I also think about the relationships that we recognize between species and fire, and thinking about wildlife that come in and forage along the fire front, like firehawks that are known in many regions of Australia. And I think about the traditional knowledge that not only my elders have shared with me in terms of if we stop burning, that wildfires would become rampant, and that by setting fires, that we know that we're going to bring the rain. And that knowledge about the interactions between climate systems and fire is something that is not only found here in California, but is also found in some of the areas of Australia where I've worked too. And I think about how my experiences of burning in the Cape York Peninsula, many times when we set fires and burning with community, they burn and then the rains come in the evening and they put those fires out and they become self-limiting. And so there's all these different associations that are there that we need to understand, that we need to recognize. And in order to be good stewards, we need to be paying attention to these things. And Indigenous knowledge systems are the places where that is at. When I think about the present, I think about the many challenges that I have experienced and that other Indigenous scholars and community members have faced. And I think about my own experiences with peer review in the early part of my career, where people challenged what Indigenous fire was simply because I talked about people using drip torches as a tool for ignitions. As it turns out, we know that Indigenous peoples use many different tools and that our cultures are fully adaptable, and they should be. We have to recognize that. In regards to research, there are other things that we also need to be considering regarding Indigenous scholars and Indigenous subjects. We need to think about it in terms of the research that we do and engage with. We need to think about how to cite Indigenous sources for knowledge systems that are being used in informing our methodologies. We need to think about how to incorporate Indigenous reviewer suggestions in peer review. And we need to start recognizing the place of Indigenous fire, scholars, methodologies, histories within the academic world. We need to think about it in relationship to our resources. Furthermore, we need to be aware of appropriation and misappropriation of knowledge. Beyond those specifics of research needs, though, are also the implications of perceptions and misperceptions of Indigenous fire. And there are some specific ones that I think are important to recognize around the restoration of Indigenous fire and the qualifications of Indigenous peoples to engage with fire. I've had people tell me, it's interesting about Indigenous fire, but we can't bring it back because there's too many people living in the landscape. We have too many assets at risk, and vegetation has changed. And I consider that a cop-out to recognize that Indigenous processes of using fire have been present in many of our landscapes, particularly in the areas of the world where I do work with fire. And I think about the opportunities that are missing because of the absence of fire within those landscapes, particularly under Indigenous stewardship. But I also think about the various statements that I've heard that are really damaging to the ways and challenges that we think about where Indigenous fire can exist in this world. I've heard things like, we'd like to work with them, but they don't have the qualifications. And I think in response to that, for Indigenous fire practitioners, it takes a lifetime of learning to become proficient in burning. And going through the trainings to become a prescribed burn boss is something that doesn't include our cultural knowledge systems. So there's arguments that could be made on both sides of this sort of thing. There are many barriers that exist to putting Indigenous fire back on the land, as I alluded to previously. To think about it from a legal perspective, in 1793 we had the first laws in California that banned Indigenous people from burning. The first Spanish governor of California set forth a proclamation that set the most severe punishment for people who were using fire. And similar acts took place across the world as colonization took place. And we're still dealing with the ramifications of that, not only in terms of the impacts to culture, but the impacts to the ability to put fire back onto the landscape today. As I think about that, there are many challenges that I'll identify. In the past year, I had the opportunity to work on some of these issues, to develop and highlight some of this, to shape policy, which I'll talk about on Thursday's special session on Indigenous fire. Some of those things include the lack of understanding and respect for sovereignty, that also agencies are ill-equipped to work with tribes. There's a lot of turnover that exists within agencies, and it's really difficult to form working relationships when there is that turnover and there's not a continuity of practice within the agencies combined with the local people. There's also a lack of recognition and support for what Indigenous fire is. Thinking about the idea of the qualification system is an example of that. The biggest, probably fundamental thing that we need to be thinking about is the right to burn, which gets back to our traditional laws. We need to think about access and land tenure. We need to think about the changes that we need to be making to environmental regulation in certain parts of the world. We need to understand the difference between what cultural burning is and what other types of burning might be, and how do they interplay with one another. We need to address liability and fear. We also need to be thinking about the existing conditions and how certain things like invasive species might be addressed by the use of Indigenous fire based on the time of year when it's put in. We need to deal with funding this sorts of opportunities for Indigenous fire and building capacity for communities and practitioners to be able to engage in these sorts of activities at a landscape scale. We also need to address the racism that exists and the invisibility, exclusion, and erasure that happens frequently, not only in terms of projects that are being developed, but also in what's published. So next, I'd like to talk about why Indigenous fire matters. For Indigenous peoples, the relationship between fire and the world around us is interconnected. And I think about that through what I call ecocultural kinship and fire dependence. And I'll reference Deborah Bird Rose, the American anthropologist who lived in Australia, in her book Wild Dog Dreaming. She talks about the relationship that Indigenous peoples have with plants, animals, and country that is achieved through kinship. And she specifically states that in thinking about endangered species, many Indigenous peoples have faced extinction themselves, and the declining species are inherently tied through kinship to people through those relationships. I know for me, I can specifically relate to that. And I think about the rare species that exist in our landscapes, from the California condor and the red-legged frog. And even in Australia, with the indigenous communities that I work with there, like palm cockatoo in the northeast of Australia, as rare species that are culturally significant. And we have relationships with them, and those relationships are maintained through fire. Why indigenous fire is unique is that it's based off of certain characteristics that are following traditional law, following specific objectives, and achieving certain outcomes within the landscape, and also that right to burn. Indigenous fire is multi-generational. It begins at birth and ends beyond death. It's a cycle that we're all part of. And we learn through that process of working with our community, working with our families, and burning together to achieve the outcomes of things that we want within the landscape at various scales, from an individual plant on up to a watershed. But never in the same context as, say, the scale of a wildfire, the large fires that we see devastating massive areas of the world today. And it's not so much about the size of those fires, but the impacts that those fires are having. And that's some of the things that make indigenous fire unique. So why it matters is really something that we all need to be recognizing, is that wildfires are running rampant across many areas of our landscapes. We're seeing type conversion that will take generations to overcome, if they can at all. And I think about that particular change within the landscape, the impact that it has not only on those ecosystems and the functionality of that system as a whole, but also the impact to our social structure and fabric, the impacts of our own mental health through solastalgia and the change within those landscapes. I think about the loss of biodiversity. I also think about the impacts to our sacred sites. Those are just some of the reasons why we need to be thinking about it. And in reflecting upon this, I think of Jan van Wegdendonk's comments during a banquet speech that he gave several years ago. And he said that fire is not a disturbance. And I think about this because in reality, fire is not a disturbance. The disturbance occurred when we removed indigenous fire from the landscape. Fire is a process, and indigenous peoples, as part of that system, are part of that process. So when we come to terms with that, then we see an opportunity that exists, and we start to sense the urgency that's there, that we need to start reading the landscape. We need to start understanding how and where we can use fire in the same ways that indigenous communities have done since time immemorial, and working with indigenous communities to support that. And I think about those relationships of fire as being applied spatially and temporally within a landscape. Certain ecosystems that are ready to burn at certain times of the year based on the soil conditions, based on the vegetation phenology. And when we read these things coming to play within that landscape, we know where and when fire should be applied, and we know that we're going to change ultimately the behavior of future fires that might happen in that landscape because of the actions that we've taken. One of the best examples that comes to my mind about this is standing on the Ubir floodplain in Kakadu National Park during my first trip in 2003. And as I looked out over that floodplain, I saw a tidal wetland, I saw monsoon forest, I saw savannas, and I saw the scrub-type communities on the slopes of distant hills. And fire was evident in that scene. And you could see how fire could be applied to protect the monsoon forest, to renew and regenerate the green grasses for kangaroos and other herbivores to forage on, and to open up areas in the wetlands for geese to come in and forage on, and those distant hills being burned to allow for productivity to be encouraged in those places again. So there are many examples of where indigenous communities have maintained the use of fire and where those fires are starting to be rekindled. And I think about the networks of indigenous peoples working together to support one another and support the communities and practitioners around the world. In particular, I think about the Fire Sticks Alliance in Australia. We've got the Nature Conservancy with the Indigenous Peoples Burning Network, and emerging in California, the Intertribal Indigenous Stewardship Project. And it's really a privilege and honor to be able to be part of that movement and seeing the progress that it's making and seeing the growth of these entities around the world. One of the greatest opportunities that's there for us is to be able to train in our own ways. And I think about the models of how that's been achieved through the workshops of the National Indigenous Fire Workshops in Australia that Fire Sticks Alliance has put together. And I think about what that looks like in terms of bringing people together on homelands of indigenous communities to steward and learn to use fire within those places. And these workshops are not exclusive to indigenous peoples. Those workshops include private landowners, agency personnel, Indigenous community, and so many others. And I think about the ways that those fires are set. I think about the ways that those trainings take place that really encompass everything that I've been talking about. It's intergenerational. It moves beyond boundaries and is really impactful and empowering of people. And one of the things that I want to highlight is something that often makes people who are not familiar with Indigenous fire uncomfortable. Young children burning and people not wearing PPE. And I like to show these images to remind people that Indigenous cultures are very well knowledgeable about fire, and that term of risk and recognition of liability is not something that we have in our Indigenous languages. And I also think about the informal opportunities that often exist around introducing people to fire, sometimes for the first time within their own homelands, and how empowering that is for people for the very first time to be able to see the relationship of fire, maybe at the individual plant scale, but sometimes even larger than that, and thinking about where and how we can be using fire to help to heal culture and to help to heal the land. I also think about the opportunities that come from stewarding that landscape. And in particular, I think about how in California, many of the drivers of our burning are really linked to subsistence activities like harvesting of basket plants and what those good fires do for our landscapes. Beyond the training, there's opportunities for research, what I call research on native terms. Research that allows for the incorporation of stewardship principles and understandings and questions that we as Indigenous peoples have about our landscapes and the ways that we think about those places. We need to be thinking about how to support the needs of Indigenous communities through research and allow for the visibility of Indigenous scholars in that space. For me in particular, I think about some of the earlier works by Dean Yarbrough and others as Indigenous authors of fire ecology papers, and how impactful that was for me to be able to see that this work was being done by other Indigenous peoples addressing needs within their own communities. In retrospect, I also think about and recognize that we need to be making space for those coming behind us. And we need to be thinking about the opportunities for how to mentor and build confidence and leadership within our youth and allow for more inclusive representation of them in the process and have a seat at the table as well. On Thursday morning, we'll have a special session that includes some conversations with folks who have worked with Indigenous communities in doing the work that they do and talk very openly about what those experiences have been like. Ultimately, I think about the opportunities that are there at a landscape scale to develop Indigenous-led and culturally informed burning practices. And I think about the work that I've done locally here in California to work with agencies like CAL FIRE to inform them about ways that we think about the ecocultural knowledge systems of when and how to burn within the landscape and the outcomes that those fires create. It's not all about black acres, and there's very distinct differences between what prescribed fire might achieve and what Indigenous fire or Indigenous informed fire might allow for within that same landscape. We need to be working to change policy. We need to think about the barriers that are there. In particular, I think about how we could work towards recognizing the law of the land, the traditional Indigenous laws that exist. We need to think about ways of supporting what the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples implies around stewardship. We need to recognize sovereignty, and we need to allow space for Indigenous peoples to re-engage through that kind of policy. And I'll share some of the successes in California in our Thursday session. We also need to be telling our stories. And I think about Amy Cardinal Christensen's Good Fire podcast and Victor Stephenson's Fire Country as some of the great examples in recent years of the ways that we're telling our stories. And there's also academic writings. In Gleb Gregor-Detsky's book, Archipelago of Hope, he describes how globally Indigenous peoples are underrepresented, yet steward approximately 20% of the Earth's surface and an astounding amount of global biodiversity. To me, that's one reason why we should be thinking about Indigenous fire. We need to be thinking about it in terms of carbon, climate, and we need to be thinking about it at the right scale, the ecological unit scale. In terms of the models that are out there, co-management is one of those models that's there, but it's probably not enough. We need to be thinking bigger than that. Because co-management in its own right can sometimes get sidetracked by agency agendas and not really fulfilling the needs of Indigenous peoples within places. In 2019, there was a recognition that we need to be thinking about greater conservation to meet the goals for biodiversity and climate change into the future. And I think about the 30 by 30 initiative and E.O. Wilson's concept of the half Earth. In terms of dealing with stewardship in the big picture, where are we at? Where are we going with it? Ultimately, for me, whatever stewardship we do needs to be focused on functionality and resilience across time. It needs to be adaptable based on process. As I stated earlier, indigenous fire is process within many landscapes, and it needs to be inclusive of the whole web. And so when I think about stewardship and defining what that is, it's a functional socio-ecological system that's less vulnerable and more sustainable through time due to capacity of people to steward for resilience through natural processes, which includes indigenous peoples' ways of knowing and being. And so I think about the opportunities that exist around the further growth of and support for indigenous protected areas and conservation areas. I think about what land back might mean, even though there's some complexities to the ways that these lands may be repatriated. We need to be thinking about ways of reconnecting people to their homelands. In our fire circle on Friday, we'll talk more about the opportunities to support some of these initiatives and what it might mean for the Association for Fire Ecology to support some of this as an organization. Ultimately, we need to be working toward the right to burn as a right to resilience. And so there are some choices that we have to make. We either continue to deal with the ramifications of wildfires and get overrun by them, or we take a more proactive approach to the stewardship of indigenous fire within the landscapes. Very different outcomes, and I think we've got lots of opportunities for putting fire back in as first entry into some of these places, but we also have the footprints of these fires that have been happening as ways of coming in to steward again, and we need to be thinking about how to integrate fire back into those places as well. So in closing, and I hope this gives some inspiration, maybe an opportunity to reflect upon the ways that we as individuals can engage around fire stewardship to support indigenous peoples and the stewardship of fire within our landscapes. Thank you for your time, and I'm looking forward to the many great presentations that are scheduled for this year's Congress, and I'll look forward to seeing you in a future Congress.
Well, that was incredible. Thank you, Don.
Thank you, Morgan.
We have time for questions, and I'll moderate the questions, but you mentioned two things that I just wanted to make sure we didn't miss. One was the special session, and the other was the fire circle. Can you remind folks about when those are?
Sure, both of those are scheduled. So the special session is set for Thursday morning. I guess here in the U.S. Or folks around the world will have to figure that out. But it's the first top of the day, and so that special session is kind of broken into two different parts. First part will be practitioners kind of giving updates. Second part of it will be more of a discussion of folks who've done research and kind of the lessons learned from that and those experiences. And then on Friday morning, we've got the fire circle that's more of a conversation of how we intend to support indigenous burning, say from a family level on up, and then also talking about maybe forming a sort of a resolution, if you will, for support of indigenous burning.
Great. Okay, there are a few questions that folks are putting in the Whova chat. The Luddite is running this. Everyone should just roll their eyes. So I'm gonna transmit a few of those to you, and then I'll remind everyone that as we get to the close here, if we were at a meeting, you may not feel comfortable asking your question. You may want to run into Don in the hallway, and so please use the Whova applications that allow you to chat, and I think he'll be excited to talk to you, and please look at those opportunities that he discussed. So Don, I'll start from the top here. Barb Wolfson asked, how can we better communicate the need for co-authorship with tribal governments and entities? Some do not allow it, which leaves Indigenous practitioners out of science. And I know that's a topic that is close to your heart.
Right. Well, I think in terms of very specific rules around how research might get conducted within their own tribal communities. And so to begin, you have to start with the questions that that are going through kind of an IRB process within the tribe itself before you can even start engaging in that kind of research. So I think, one, if you have tribal communities that you're working with, if they have those kind of processes that are there, you have to address that first and foremost. And then I think it'll make it a lot easier for getting those papers, published and getting those researchers to engage in it. That's probably one of the bigger pieces. I think in general, one of my biggest things that I really have kind of talked about for many years is using and developing research questions with community from the first place. And so not just coming up with a question saying, hey, we want to look at this, and oh wait, as an afterthought, let's go talk to the tribal people in this area about it. Starting at the ground level is really important. And I think that if you're able to start at that level and kind of build from that, then it also empowers people to have a little bit more decision making in terms of that process, and buy-in that ultimately allows for comfort in publishing. And I know that for some of the work in the communities in Australia that we have a lot of different people that have published simply from being involved in guiding that research. Maybe they're setting fires, maybe they're taking researchers out. Like I think about some of the Mardu folks in the Western Desert, who are working very closely with different folks from different fields in fire, and they're the ones who are using their knowledge and setting fires, and other folks are coming in and kind of looking at it under the microscope. But ultimately, the people who are engaged in setting the fires and so forth are listed as authors on those papers. So it kind of depends on the communities, though.
Cool. I like that. The not as an afterthought, but as the forethought that's great.
Yeah.
Joanna Nelson asked, with your experience with fire sticks and how you conduct burns with CSU Chico students, how would you suggest expanding Indigenous people training in your own ways and then using fire on landscapes?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. The model that exists for the national not only tribal but agencies, as I was talking about in the presentation, and that's kind of the model that I would like to be able to use here in the U.S. and other places too, where you can have Indigenous communities serve as the host on their homelands, or in case of not having access to lands or lands of their own ownership, so to speak. You find agencies that maybe want to support that. So, I've been trying to get like the Forest Service locally to provide space for tribes to have the opportunities for doing that, or using university lands for that sort of thing. In fact, Frank Lake and Mary Huffman and myself did a case study in Rigo et al.'s recent book on fire science, where we talk about the opportunities for university lands to be used for these kinds of things. And so, Joanna's question and pointing out the work that I do at CSU Chico, we work with the local tribal communities, we work with the students, and we get community members involved, from all different aspects of it, and bring them out to learn about fire. But there's a lot of different ways to do it, and I think that having it being really organic and having it linked specifically to the cultural outcomes, an awareness of why you're burning, what the outcomes of those fires are going to be, and so forth, are really important for that. And it's very different than say a training exchange type model that we see here in the U.S., or a typical agency-based fire program. One thing that we're dealing with currently in the state, and I'll probably talk more about this on my kind of spotlight on California on Thursday, is the ideas of like a qualification center. And Morgan, you're involved in some of the conversations in California around development of a fire training center. And what does that look like for Indigenous communities to engage in that? We have to recognize sovereignty, but we also maybe have to have some kind of So I don't know if that addresses everything that Joanna wanted to know, but
it did. You're breaking up, which is reminded me. Thank you for for pre-recording your talk. We knew we'd have this issue. She followed up, and you hit her question out of the park. And yeah, I think that's great. We have time for probably one more. And Lisa Huff made an observation that when we watch video, it's so different than watching still images in a talk. And I love to see it, because particularly when it's video of fire. And she had a comment here that it seems that they're pretty reluctant to use head fires. And in your own experience, do you find there's a greater appreciation that applying fire is not it's not a monolithic application, that it is super diverse? Could you discuss a little bit of that?
You're talking about in terms of firing directions and things like that. It really depends on the context of the landscape. And it's it was fun putting this together, because for years I take the camera out with me and look at my own archives. But in some years, like that one meadow system where I walk out and I lit a head fire, that system in that particular year had to be lit with a head fire in order to carry fire in it. And the next time I ran fire in it, we backed it down to that meadow. And then last year when we burned it, we did another head fire on it. It really just depends on how dry it is and what those limits of the landscape are. But a lot of times, if you're trying to get the intensity to get rid of invasive species, or to get the desired fire effects, you really have to be aware, and that's where that reading the landscape really comes into play. I don't recommend it for folks who've never used fire before to start out with a head fire. That's probably the folks dragging a chain down the highway or whatever. That's going to be their experience as a head fire. Start small if you're just beginning with it, but. Yeah, it's interesting to think about. It's like if you look at the imagery of burns in the western desert of Australia, and you can see from satellite imagery and other imagery like these fire scars. A lot of times you just see these kind of linear strips of burns, and it's sometimes it's that, and sometimes it's kind of a blob that has lots of fingers to it, and it really just depends on what the objectives of that burn are and what you're trying to get out of that particular space at that time.
Yeah, great. Well, we're out of time. I really appreciated that, and I know that I can see the comments. Thanks so much for doing this for us and for kicking us off appropriately. What we wanted is something that was both provocative and inspirational, and I think on both counts, you did exactly. You over-delivered. So thank you very much for doing that. And if you have questions I didn't get to a few, please communicate with Don, and I'm going to pass the microphone to Karin.
Thanks, Morgan. I'm Karin Riley, and I'm the chair of AFI's Diversity and Inclusivity Committee. And I think I have served on this board since approximately 2000 BC. One of the reasons I do that is this community is extremely inspiring to me. And I've missed that, not being able to meet in person, but I think we're proving this morning, at least to me, I feel extremely inspired by what Don has said and Morgan and Chris this morning, and I want to thank them for that. I'm broadcasting to you this morning from the land of the Salish in Missoula, Montana, whose people have stewarded this land and its water and its fire for some time and continue to do so. And I want to thank Don and Morgan and Chris all for really bringing to the fore a message that I want to talk about this morning, which is the word belonging. And that's a word I'm starting to see showing up more and more often when you read about the diversity and inclusivity movement, that we're really at this moment in time, we're moving beyond just the notion of including diverse peoples, but furthering this sense that goes even deeper than that, this sense of belonging. And I want to encourage all of you as you attend the conference this week, maybe I should say attend in quotes, I invite you to consider reflecting on what it means to foster a sense of belonging in each other. So one way that we at AFI have been moving toward the goals of inclusion and belonging is in our slate of plenary speakers. We want those to represent the growing diversity we see in the wildland fire professions in terms of gender, race, ethnicity, and nationality. Wildland fire has many complex problems in it, and research shows us that our collective ability to solve these kind of complex problems is strengthened when our teams include diverse backgrounds and viewpoints. Our ability to learn how to live with fire in the future depends on ensuring wildland fire professions are open, inclusive, and actively supportive of a more diverse workforce. And especially, I want to give a message to the students and young career folks in the audience this morning. You are our future at AFI. We invite your feedback, ideas, and partnership as we continue to work to make AFI more supportive for all. We oftentimes have more than 400 presentations at our large events. And so we recognize there's a really important role that presenters play in developing the program and creating that learning environment. AFI also seeks to help our members and event attendees better understand unconscious bias, microaggressions, and how to be an active bystander. So we at the Diversity and Inclusivity Committee have worked with Annie. Annie did a great job on taking the lead on this too, to provide a set of resources about these types of issues, along with recommendations for creating presentations that are both inclusive and accessible to all. Annie is going to drop a link to those inclusive learning guidelines in the chat for us. So unfortunately, we are aware that unwelcome and even threatening incidents can still happen among our community. And these can range at one end of the scale from things like unwanted touching and even worse to offensive content on slides. Incidents can be brought to our attention at the AFI board. You can bring them specifically to my attention as the Diversity and Inclusivity Chair. You can send them to the AFI office. There's a report form that Annie is going to drop in the chat also if you have something you want to bring to our attention. It doesn't need to be something that happened this week either. So we keep these incident reports confidential unless we're directed otherwise, but we deeply consider each one and we take action where appropriate. We are a learning organization, so we're aware that content that's offensive to one person might not be offensive to another, and we approach those as a learning opportunity. One thing I wanted to talk about too is a trend that you all might have seen recently, where you see people adding pronouns after their names, perhaps on their email banners. So after their name, it might say she/her, or he/him, or they/theirs. And if you're curious why people are doing this, I found a really meaningful video by a fellow named Craig Foreman on medium.com on this topic. And he was posting after he had a conversation with some colleagues about allyship. And I'm just going to paraphrase what he said, because I found it really meaningful. So Craig said they recommended that he add those pronouns after his name. And he said, why? I'm a straight white male. It's obvious if someone looks at me, my pronouns are he/him. And they responded by saying, that's just the point, Craig. In a world where there are many people that don't identify with the pronouns that might be associated with them based on sight, it can be very vulnerable and scary to say, wait, I don't identify with the pronoun you might want to put on me. Someone of a group that identifies as in alignment with their pronouns can walk through the world not seeing that. For us to step out there and put pronouns after our name takes very little risk and starts to normalize that and make it more acceptable, making it easier for people that want to step out and be vulnerable to say, I prefer to be identified in this way. It can also say, I'm an ally and I'm doing a small thing to support others who want to step out and identify. So if you wish to do this, if this is appealing to you, you can add pronouns after your name in your Whova profile. It's quite easy to do. I wanted to put an invitation out to those of you who are hearing this, that we have space for several new members on our Diversity and Inclusivity Committee. So if you'd like to participate, or you know someone who you think would be a good addition, please reach out. You can email me or the AFI office. In conclusion, I'm really looking forward to engaging with you all on this virtual platform this morning. I know we wish we were all having bagels and drinking coffee together and lying on the beach, but this is a really effective way for us all to interact during this pandemic. I'm certainly looking forward to when we can do this in person, but for now, here's to a great virtual week together. And I'm going to pass this virtual mic off to Brian Oswald, who was a former AFI president, and he chairs our awards committee. He's going to be presenting several awards this morning, and some of them are awards that our board designed with an eye toward recognizing different types of members, and those include early career, mid-career, and applied science.
Thanks, Karen. And if you've been here for in the AFI since 2000 BC, I won't say how long I've been in it. Just follow up a little bit on Karen's introduction. We have 3 new awards today. On Wednesday, there will be 2 Lifetime Achievement Awards, and then on Friday, there will be a few special awards given by the board. I am really thrilled that we are getting this opportunity to give these new awards, because it's one of those building that future of AFI and fire professionals is important. The first one is an Applied Fire Science Award, and it recognizes individuals who integrate both fire science and ecological principles into their management and planning strategies. Nominees should have a great record to the application of fire science on the ground and be leaders in the effort to better connect science and management. And our first award winner for this ever is Christopher Helzer. He's the Nature Conservancy Director of Science in Nebraska, where his main role is to evaluate and capture lessons from the Conservancy's land management and restoration work. He works very hard at raising awareness on the value of prairies and prairie conservation through various media, including photography, writing, and presentations. Frequent contributor in Nebraska Land Magazine and Wildflower Magazine, author of 2 books. And please join me then in recognizing, and he's going to be participating via Zoom, our first award winner for the Applied Fire Science Award, Christopher Helzer.
Thanks, Brian. I really appreciate that. I'm gratified to get the award. I feel like it's a little undeserved. I don't think of myself primarily as a fire person. I think of myself as an ecologist in land management who uses fire as part of my role, part of my job, which I guess fits the applied science description. So maybe that's why it makes sense. I did want to share my screen real quick since they told me I get a couple minutes. I'm going to not skip an opportunity to share a quick thought that I had. So first of all, I want to make sure that I recognize that, you know, my role in fire, especially within the Nature Conservancy, is pretty small. I work with a lot of people who are much smarter about fire than I am, that I learn from, and I appreciate the opportunity to get to work with them, both within the Conservancy and a lot of the partners that we work with. What I wanted to talk about real quick is that as someone who works in kind of land management with fire as a piece of it, when I hear from people in the central United States, which is where I work, about fire, most people just want to know, what do I need to do? How do I need to use this? When and how often do I burn? And most of the time, that's because they have a very simple objective they're trying to achieve with fire. They're trying to kill trees, they're trying to make bigger cows, or they're trying to make fire keep their plant diversity high. And some of these people are skeptical of fire. Some of them are maybe too much on the other end of that spectrum in terms of how they use fire. But it typically is a very simple recipe they want. And a lot of that is based on history. They have this idea that if we could just figure out how often fire happened in the past and what time of year it happened, we could just replicate that and we'll be fine, which would be great, except that we're not managing for the past, we're managing for the future, which is much more difficult. And that's why I was really happy to see the theme of this conference, revolving around resilience, because that's what I think about all the time too, especially with all the challenges we're facing right now. Biodiversity and resilience, if that's the focus, and then fire is one aspect of how we get there, that's what I think we need to translate. So as a communicator about fire, I think our biggest job has been getting people to think about fire as something that's important. And I think we're making huge strides there. You know, at least in the central US where I'm at, that message is getting through. The more tricky thing is the second piece, which is getting fire to be seen as part of this large, complex picture of ecology, instead of just, you know, a tool that you apply to make bigger cows or to get rid of trees. So I want to say thank you to everybody for all the work that's going on around the world with prescribed fire and wildfire management. And again, thanks for the award. I really appreciate it.
Okay, I'm waiting for technology to catch up with me a little bit. So there we go. Thanks, Chris. The second award we're giving today is what we AFI's calling the Early Career Award, which recognizes individuals who have made outstanding contributions within the first 10 years of their career. And they can work in any area related to fire ecology and management. It could be their emphasis could be in contribution, could be in research and management, teaching, service, outreach, or a combination. Just to let you know, nominees should have graduated or have experienced a career change in the field of fire ecology and management within 10 years prior to the nomination. The awardee for this award is Devin McCrenahan. He became interested in fire ecology as a graduate student studying patch burn grazing at Iowa State. We seem to have a grassland trend for this session. After a Fulbright scholarship in South Africa, studying fire in montane grasslands and promotion to associate professor of range science at North Dakota State, he joined the USDA ARS Livestock and Range Research Lab in Miles City, Montana. While at North Dakota State, led students and faculty in prescribed burns and designed and taught a fire ecology course. Is published and co-authored in the textbook, The Ecology of Fire-Dependent Ecosystems, in addition to 2 book chapters, and over, for some of us, an envious record of 50 peer-reviewed research publications. His research is focused on sustainable livestock production in the Great Plains, with an emphasis on how prescribed fire can help ranchers adapt to drought and manage healthy ecosystems. So again, join me in congratulating Devin on receiving this award.
Well, I really appreciate that. I get the understanding that I can speak for a couple minutes on that. You're right about the Great Plains trend. You know, coming into this, there's a lot of great mentors and colleagues and now students that have gotten my career to this point, and not least in there is Chris Helzer, who I met early on and during the patch burning thing, and resonates well with still what he's thinking about is how fire fits into the entire ecosystem, regardless of what your products from that ecosystem are, what ecosystem services you're looking for to be delivered, and seeing it as the whole system there, and how biodiversity and conservation can and production can co-occur. I've called it in the States, we tend to have John Deere on one side of the fence and John Muir on the other. And I think blending the production and conservation in our landscapes is functional and important and probably necessary in the future. I'd like to engage this Indigenous discussion a bit. I really appreciate seeing that. And also there others out there might be wondering how they fit in and how they can further these and these goals. And they are difficult. I have moved from the university to Eastern Montana, working with the ARS, and I guess I am now on Crow, Cheyenne, and Sioux land. Some of the critiques I've heard about those land acknowledgements is they're not really doing too much unless they come along with some indication of what one might be doing to try to rectify past wrongs. I went to our local tribal colleges online because this is an area where there are a lot of reservations, and they have both the Cheyenne and the Sioux have tribal colleges, and they have these PayPal buttons to donate. So I set up these recurring donations to help education on the tribal areas around here. and also trying to think about how we can get more people involved through internships and all that, not just supporting education, but then trying to get individuals specifically involved in our work. But it's hard. There's institutional legacies that are difficult. I mean, my lab is named after one of the people, one of the generals shot at Little Bighorn. And this is the lab here is a former cavalry installation for the US Army. And so if you're going to try to convince a young Native American scholar that they should come here to train for some of their to get technical proficiency or whatever in the Western scientific culture, I think that there's an institutional legacy there that is difficult to overcome. And so you can say like, well, we've made this opportunity available, but what have we really done to meet somebody on their own land? It's difficult when my colleague Chris Wonka and I just published a textbook on fire ecology, and it was really a goal of ours to try to be inclusive, diverse, and trying to get literature from all over the world, but then also different perspectives. We know that illustration is important, so we thought like, oh, we should get a picture of some Aboriginal Australians burning in an indigenous manner. And then you start poking around and realizing that actually it's deeply offensive to a lot of Aboriginal persons to have or to see deceased individuals depicted and lasting in photographs. So something I didn't know, and we probably could have really put our foot in our mouth had we proceeded with all these images that we had kind of thought would be showing diversity when actually you're causing some harm in that. So we went with pictures of spinifex grasslands and that stuff, and just showed the landscape things. So I encourage everybody to engage it. It's difficult. You're going to make some mistakes, but just always try to be learning from them. I'm really excited about the rest of this conference, and I really appreciate the award. Thank you.
And again, congratulations, Devin. The last of our three, and not least of the new awards, is kind of like in the middle of the bookends we have. We've had the Lifetime Achievement Award and then the Early Career. And so the discussion at the AFI board and the awards committee was the middle ground, the mid-career type of award. And so what's unique about this award, and I'm really thrilled that AFI's going this direction, is that this award recognizes individuals who are mid-career and have become an exceptional leader in fire ecology management in either research, education, or management. So it depends on where their strengths are, which is great. And they can work in any of the related fire ecology and management fields. And should at least 10 years since they got their degree, and should be at least 10 years from their expected retirement. The recipient for this award for 2021 is Kirk Davies, a lead rangeland scientist with ARS in Eastern Oregon. In Burns, Oregon, he obtained a BS degree in crop and soil science and rangeland resources in 2000, and got a PhD from Oregon State in 2005. He was hired by ARS in 2006. 127 peer-reviewed scientific journal articles, regularly requested to evaluate and advise on post-fire restoration plans for the BLM, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services, state agencies, private landowners, because of his expertise, especially looking at grazing fire interactions. And his work is recognized globally with research in South America, North America, Asia, and Australia, implementing projects based on his pioneering research on novel post-fire restoration strategies. And I understand he is not able to join us, but he did send a video. So I am stalling a little bit to allow the tech people to get that pulled up. Sorry if I talk too fast on that.
Thank you for honoring me with this award. I'm very pleased to be recognized by my peers in fire ecology and fire management. In my career, I've been very blessed to work with some amazing people at the Eastern Oregon Ag Research Center in Burns, Oregon, and owe my success to many of them. In particular, I'd like to thank Dr. John Bates, who has been an amazing collaborator, as well as helped me set up some of my first research in investigating fire effects. I've also would like to thank my two amazing bosses in my career, Dr. Tony Savekar and Dr. Chad Boyd. They both put the success of the research unit above their own success. Thank you. I've also had the pleasure of working with some amazingly talented scientists, both at our unit, across the Western United States, and around the world. Thank you. I have also some amazing, talented collaborators and colleagues that I'd like to thank for your friendship, your insightful discussions, and your thoughtful suggestions. There are too many of you to name, but you know who you are. Thank you. Thanks again for nominating me and bestowing this award on me. I'm truly honored. Thank you.
Oh, Brian, I think you're muted if you want to go ahead and unmute.
There we go. Sorry about that. Again, I want to congratulate all three award winners. You kind of set the bar high for future years on these three awards. And according to my notes, I get to turn it back over to Morgan to wrap up this session.
Thanks, Brian. And thanks to our speakers, and congratulations to the awardees. I'm an awardee sucker. I love hearing that sort of stuff. We all work so hard, and rarely do we get recognized for the work that we do. And so I think when they're accumulated and they're a cumulative award, it's really nice. The early awards are nice too, because it's both an award and a challenge. You've done well so far, now turn it up. So what we're going to do between now and when the concurrent sessions begin in 15 minutes is take a break. I'll say briefly, we have multiple sessions that have incredible speakers. If you already perused the list, remember to use that agenda tab in Whova to the left and click sessions to choose the one you'd like to join. You can also click the subsessions for more details about what to expect. And please note that the special session this afternoon, or whatever your time zone is, with Spanish and Portuguese interpretation available, is the interrelationships between invasive plants and fire management. That's being chaired by Matt Brooks. And with that, I'll encourage you to take a break, get some steps, and we'll see you in 15 minutes. Thanks, everybody.